Elira Vance woke before dawn, as she always did. The small cottage she shared with her aunt sat at the edge of Renfield Village, where the morning mist rolled low over the fields and the birds began their songs before the sun had fully risen. She lit a candle, dressed quietly, and walked to the corner of the room where her harp stood, tall and golden in the dim light. It had been her mother's harp once, passed down like a quiet promise, and Elira treated it with the same care one might give to a sleeping child. She was 22 years old, and for the last 4 years she had earned a modest living teaching harp to the daughters of local families. It was not a grand life, but it was hers. She had a roof over her head, food on her table, and music in her hands. Most mornings, that felt like enough. On this particular morning, however, something unusual was about to happen. A knock came at the door just as the sun was beginning to climb over the hills. Elira's aunt, Martha, answered it, her apron still dusted with flour from the morning bread. Standing outside was a young man in a fine gray coat, holding a sealed letter in his gloved hand. He did not look like anyone from the village. His boots were too clean, his posture too straight, and his horse, tied to the fence post, was far too well groomed for a farmer's errand. "I am looking for a Miss Elira Vance," the man said, his voice polite but formal. "I was told she teaches the harp." Martha called for her niece, and Elira came to the door, wiping her hands on her skirt, curious and a little nervous. She had never received a letter delivered by a messenger before. Most of her correspondence came through the postmaster in the village square, folded and a little worn from travel. This letter was different. It was sealed with wax, pressed with a crest she did not recognize. A hawk, with its wings spread wide, sitting atop a shield.
"Setting atop a shield."
"I am Elira Vance," she said. The messenger bowed slightly and held out the letter. "This is from the household of Ashcombe Manor. You are requested to appear this evening to perform for a private gathering. A carriage will be sent for you at 4 o'clock. Elira blinked, certain she had misheard. "Ashcombe Manor?" "Yes, miss. I am told it is a simple request. You are to play one piece, a waltz, for a small assembly. Nothing more is expected of you." With that, the messenger bowed again, turned, and walked back to his horse, leaving Elira standing in the doorway, with the letter still unopened in her hand. Martha peered over her niece's shoulder. "Ashcombe Manor," she repeated, her voice hushed, as though the very name required a lowered tone. "Elira, do you know whose house that is?" Elira shook her head slowly. She had heard the name before, the way one hears the name of a distant mountain, familiar, but far away, and not something that touched her daily life. "That is the estate of the Duke of Ashcombe," Martha said, "though no one in this village has seen him in years, not since his wife passed. They say he keeps to himself now. Some say he never leaves the manor at all." Elira opened the letter with careful fingers. Inside, the words were brief and formally written, requesting her presence for a single evening performance, along with payment that made her eyes widen, more than she earned in 2 months of teaching. The letter said nothing else about the Duke, or the nature of the gathering, or why a modest village harp teacher had been chosen for such an occasion. It simply requested a waltz, and nothing more. She read the letter 3 times before she fully believed it. By mid-morning, word had begun to spread through Renfield, as word always did in small villages. Neighbors stopped by under the pretense of borrowing sugar or asking about the weather, but really, they wanted to know if it was true that Elira Vance had been summoned to play for the reclusive Duke of Ashcombe. She answered their questions as best she could, though she had few answers to give. She did not know why she had been chosen. She did not know what the gathering was for. She only knew that a carriage would come for her at 4 o'clock, and that she needed to be ready. She spent the afternoon in careful preparation. She chose her best dress, a soft blue one that Martha had sewn for her the previous winter, simple but well made, with small pearl buttons down the front. She practiced her waltz piece twice more, her fingers moving over the strings with practiced ease, though her mind kept wandering to the crest on the letter, the hawk, with its wings spread wide. At exactly 4 o'clock, a carriage arrived outside the cottage. It was black, trimmed with silver, pulled by 2 dark horses that stood remarkably still, as though they too understood the importance of the occasion. The same messenger from that morning stepped down to open the door for her, and Elira, clutching her harp case tightly, said goodbye to her aunt, and stepped inside. The journey took nearly 2 hours. As the carriage rolled along the winding country roads, the scenery slowly changed. The familiar fields and low stone walls of Renfield gave way to tall iron gates, long gravel drives, and finally, as the sun began to lower in the sky, the manor itself came into view. Elira had never seen anything like it. Ashcombe Manor rose from the landscape like something out of a story, a vast stone building with tall windows that caught the last light of the day, turning gold and orange as the sun dipped behind distant hills. Ivy climbed along one side of the building, reaching toward the upper windows, and a wide staircase led up to the front doors, flanked by tall columns. The gardens surrounding the manor were perfectly kept, with neat rows of hedges and flower beds that stretched as far as she could see. The carriage came to a stop at the base of the staircase, and a servant in formal dress opened the door to help her down. Elira stepped out, her harp case in hand, and looked up at the manor with a mixture of awe and nervousness that she tried hard to hide. "This way, miss," the servant said, gesturing toward the entrance. Inside, the manor was even grander than it appeared from outside. The entrance hall stretched high above her, with a ceiling painted in soft clouds and golden light, and a chandelier hanging in the center that caught what little sunlight came through the windows, scattering it across the polished floor. Portraits lined the walls, stern faces from generations past, watching silently as she was led through the halls. The household staff moved quickly and quietly, each one focused on their tasks, but Elira noticed something odd. There was a tension in the air, a carefulness in the way people spoke, as though they were all trying not to disturb something fragile. Twice, she overheard servants speaking in hushed voices, and both times, they stopped the moment they noticed her nearby. She was led to a small music room on the ground floor, tucked away near the back of the manor, overlooking a quiet garden. The room was elegant, but simple, with a single harp already waiting near the window, though she had been told to bring her own, and had, a small sofa, and a low table with a cup of tea already prepared for her. An older woman entered the room shortly after, introducing herself as Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper. She was kind-faced but efficient, and she explained the evening's arrangements with practiced clarity. "You are to remain here and rehearse quietly until you are called," Mrs. Whitfield said. "When the signal is given, you will play the waltz, and only the waltz. Once you have finished, you may return here, and the carriage will take you home." Elira nodded, though a question had been forming in her mind since the messenger first arrived at her door. "May I ask," she said carefully, "who exactly I am playing for this evening?" Mrs. Whitfield's expression shifted, just slightly. "There is a small gathering of guests tonight. That is all you need to know, miss." "And the Duke?" Elira asked, unable to stop herself. "Will he be present?" The question seemed to catch Mrs. Whitfield off guard. For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes studying Elira as though deciding how much to say. "The Duke does not attend gatherings," she said finally. "He has not done so in quite some time. You need not concern yourself with that. Simply play your piece when called, and do not wander from this room." There was something final in her tone, a warning wrapped carefully in polite words. Elira nodded again, though the mystery of it all only deepened in her mind. Why would a household go through such trouble? A formal letter, a private carriage, generous payment, for a single waltz at a gathering the master of the house would not even attend. Mrs. Whitfield left her alone shortly after, closing the door softly behind her. Elira sat in the quiet room, sipping her tea, and looked out the window at the garden beyond. The last light of day was fading now, the sky turning shades of deep orange and purple, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of a gathering beginning to take shape in some other part of the house. She opened her harp case and began to prepare her instrument, running her fingers gently over the strings, checking each note with practiced care. The waltz she had been asked to play was not a difficult piece, a gentle, flowing melody, the kind meant for dancing, light and unhurried. She had played it many times before, for weddings and small village celebrations. It should have felt like any other performance. And yet, something about this evening felt different. Perhaps it was the size of the manor, or the strange tension among the staff, or the mystery surrounding a duke who never appeared at his own gatherings. Whatever it was, Elira found her heart beating a little faster than usual as she waited for her signal to play. Time passed slowly in the quiet music room. She practiced softly, careful not to play too loudly, mindful of Mrs. Whitfield's instructions. Occasionally, a servant would pass by the door, glancing in briefly before continuing on their way. Once, she thought she heard footsteps pause just outside the door, lingering for a moment before moving on, but when she looked up, no one was there. As the evening deepened, Elira began to notice something else. A portrait hanging on the wall of the music room, half hidden behind a curtain. She had not noticed it before, tucked as it was in the shadowed corner near the window. Curious, she rose from her seat and crossed the room to look more closely. The portrait showed a woman, young and graceful, seated at a harp much like Elira's own. Her hair was dark, her expression gentle, and there was a warmth in her painted eyes that seemed to reach across the years. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate read simply, "Lady Cecilia, Duchess of Ashcombe." Elira stood there for a long moment, studying the painting, wondering about the woman in it, who she had been, what her laughter had sounded like, why her portrait was hidden in this quiet room, rather than displayed proudly among the others in the main hall. She thought of what Martha had said that morning, about the Duke and his wife who had passed, and a quiet sadness settled over her, though she could not fully explain why. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Mrs. Whitfield stepped back into the room, her expression composed once more. "It is nearly time," she said. "When you hear the chime, you will be escorted to the hall. Please remember, one waltz, and nothing more." Elira nodded, returning to her harp, her earlier nervousness returning with new intensity now that the moment was finally approaching. She smoothed her dress, checked her instrument one final time, and waited. Somewhere deep in the manor, a soft chime rang out, clear and gentle, echoing faintly through the halls. It was time. As she was led from the music room, down a long corridor lit by flickering candles, Elira could not shake the feeling that something larger was unfolding around her, something she did not yet understand. She thought of the hidden portrait, the whispered warnings from the staff, the strange formality of a request that should have been so simple. She did not know, as she walked toward the grand hall with her harp in hand, that far above her, behind a small latticed balcony overlooking the room, someone was already waiting. Someone who had not left his private chambers for an evening gathering in over 3 years. Someone who had only agreed to allow music into his home again because of a small, quiet request from his sister, who worried for him more than she let on. Elira did not know that the Duke of Ashcombe had chosen, tonight, to listen. She only knew that she had been asked to play a simple waltz, and that she intended to play it as beautifully as she knew how. As she stepped into the grand hall, filled with the soft glow of candlelight and the quiet murmur of guests she did not recognize, Elira took a steadying breath, sat down at the harp that had been prepared for her, and placed her fingers gently upon the strings. She had no way of knowing that this single evening, this one simple waltz, was about to change the course of her life. The grand hall was unlike anything Elira had ever seen. Tall windows lined one side of the room, draped in deep green curtains that pooled softly on the polished floor. Candles burned in silver holders along the walls, their light catching on crystal glasses and the fine jewelry of the guests who stood in small groups, speaking in low, comfortable voices. A long table near the far wall held trays of food she did not recognize, arranged with the kind of care that took hours to prepare. The ceiling above her curved into a gentle dome, painted with soft images of birds in flight, and for a moment, Elira forgot to breathe. She had performed in many rooms before, village halls, small parlors, the modest sitting rooms of families who wanted music for a birthday or a wedding. None of them had prepared her for this. A servant guided her to a chair near the center of the room, where a second harp had already been placed and tuned, facing outward so that her music could reach every corner of the hall. She set down her own harp case, though she would not need it tonight, and took her seat carefully, smoothing her blue dress with steady hands, though her heart was beating quickly beneath her calm expression. No one in the room seemed to notice her at first. The guests continued their conversations, their laughter rising and falling like small waves, and Elira sat quietly, waiting for some signal to begin. She scanned the room briefly, taking in the faces around her. An older gentleman with a thick gray mustache, a young woman in a shimmering silver gown, 2 men deep in conversation near the fireplace. None of them looked like a duke. None of them seemed to be waiting for anything in particular. Then, from near the entrance, a tall woman approached her. She wore a deep red dress, elegant but simple, and her dark hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her eyes were sharp and observant, though not unkind. "You must be Miss Vance," the woman said, her voice calm and clear. "I am Lady Josephine, sister to the Duke of Ashcombe. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Elira rose slightly from her seat, unsure of the proper way to greet someone of such standing, but Lady Josephine waved a gentle hand, indicating she should remain seated. "There is no need for formality here," Lady Josephine said. "You are simply here to play, and that is more than enough." "Thank you, my lady," Elira said. "I am honored to be asked." Lady Josephine studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You come highly recommended. I am told your music has a way of settling a room. I hope that is true tonight." Before Elira could ask what she meant, Lady Josephine gave a small nod and returned to the gathering, leaving Elira with even more questions than before. Why would a room full of guests, laughing and chatting freely, need to be settled by music? What kind of gathering was this, truly? She did not have long to wonder. A few minutes later, a servant approached and gave her a small, respectful nod, the signal she had been waiting for. It was time to begin. Elira placed her fingers on the strings of the harp, took a slow breath, and began to play. The waltz started softly, the first notes rising gently into the air like the beginning of a quiet conversation. She had played this piece many times, but tonight, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and the weight of the grand hall around her, she poured a little more care into every note, a little more feeling into every movement of her fingers across the strings. Slowly, the room began to change. Conversations quieted, guests turned toward her, drawn by the melody, and some began to move toward the open space at the center of the hall, pairing off for the dance. The music filled the room, warm and flowing, weaving between the tall windows and rising up toward the painted ceiling above. Elira closed her eyes briefly as she played, letting herself sink into the familiar comfort of the music, the one place where she always felt certain of herself, no matter how grand the room or how uncertain the circumstances. For a few minutes, she forgot about the mystery of the letter, the hidden portrait in the music room, the strange tension among the staff. There was only the harp, the melody, and the quiet joy of watching people dance. She did not know that, above her, hidden behind a small wooden balcony, with a delicate lattice screen, someone else was listening just as closely. The Duke of Ashcombe stood in the shadows of the balcony, a place he had claimed as his own since the death of his wife, 3 years earlier. From here, he could observe the gatherings his sister insisted on hosting, without being seen himself, without having to speak to guests he no longer had the patience for, without having to pretend that everything in his life had returned to normal. It was a small mercy, this hidden space, and he used it more often than anyone in the household realized. He had expected tonight to be like every other evening he endured this way. Polite music, played competently, followed by the quiet relief of returning to his private study once the gathering had ended. He had not expected the first notes of the waltz to catch him so completely off guard. There was something in the way the harpist played, not just skill, though her skill was evident, but something warmer, more thoughtful. The notes did not simply fill the room. They seemed to move through it with intention, as though the music itself understood the weight of the silence it was meant to break. He found himself stepping closer to the lattice screen, drawn forward by a feeling he had not experienced in a long time. He could not see her clearly from this distance, only the shape of her at the harp, her head bowed slightly in concentration, her arms moving with practiced grace. But he did not need to see her clearly to feel the effect of her playing. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the tightness in his chest, the constant, quiet weight he had carried since his wife's passing, eased, if only slightly, if only for the length of a single waltz. He remained at the balcony long after the piece ended, watching as the guests below applauded softly and returned to their conversations, as the harpist rose from her seat and was quietly led from the hall. He told himself he would return to his study now, as he always did. He told himself this changed nothing. And yet, he found himself lingering at the balcony a moment longer than usual, turning her performance over in his mind, wondering, briefly, who she was. Downstairs, Elira was led back toward the small music room, where she had waited earlier that evening. Her heart was still light from the performance, the familiar satisfaction of a piece well played settling comfortably in her chest. She had done what she came to do. Soon, she assumed, The carriage would be ready to take her home. But as she reached the corridor leading back to the music room, she noticed something odd. The household staff seemed even more tense than before, moving quickly through the halls, exchanging glances that Alira could not quite interpret. She caught fragments of hushed conversation as she passed, words like upstairs and he never does this, though she could not make sense of what they meant. When she reached the music room, Mrs. Whitfield was waiting for her, though her expression had shifted from its earlier composed calm into something closer to surprise. "Miss Vance," Mrs. Whitfield said, "there has been a slight change in the evening's arrangements." Alira's stomach tightened slightly. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing wrong," Mrs. Whitfield said quickly, though her tone suggested she herself was still adjusting to whatever news she was about to deliver. "You are simply requested to remain a little longer than expected. The carriage will not be ready for some time yet." "Of course," Alira said, though she could not hide her curiosity. "May I ask why?" Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, glancing briefly over her shoulder before answering. "It is not my place to say. Please, make yourself comfortable. I will bring more tea." She left the room quickly, before Alira could ask anything further, and Alira was once again left alone in the quiet music room, the mystery of the evening deepening with every passing moment. She sat down near the window, glancing again at the hidden portrait of Lady Cecilia, the Duke's late wife, still tucked in its shadowed corner. The room felt different now, knowing that somewhere above her, in some hidden part of the house, something unusual was unfolding, something connected, perhaps, to her performance. Time passed slowly. The tea Mrs. Whitfield promised arrived, though the housekeeper herself did not return to explain further. Alira sipped it slowly, staring out at the darkened garden beyond the window, listening to the faint sounds of the gathering continuing somewhere else in the house. Laughter, music, the soft murmur of conversation. She was beginning to grow restless when, nearly an hour later, she heard a knock at the door. She rose to answer it, expecting Mrs. Whitfield once again. Instead, standing in the doorway was a man she did not recognize. Tall, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead, dressed in a simple dark coat, far less formal than the fine clothing of the guests in the grand hall. His expression was unreadable, careful, as though he was choosing his words even before he spoke them. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I was told the harpist was waiting here." Alira blinked, caught off guard by his sudden appearance. "I am the harpist," she said carefully. "May I ask who you are?" The man paused for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite place. Curiosity, perhaps, or something closer to disbelief. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter still. "I wanted to ask," he said, "about the piece you played tonight." Alira tilted her head slightly, confused. "The waltz? It is a common piece. I did not think it was anything unusual." "No," the man said, shaking his head slowly. "Not the waltz. Something else. While you waited earlier, you were humming a melody. Do you remember it?" Alira thought back, trying to recall. She often hummed quietly to herself while waiting, without thinking much of it. Old tunes she had learned as a child, half-remembered melodies passed down from her mother, along with the harp itself. She could not recall exactly what she had hummed while sitting in this very room hours earlier. "I am not certain," she admitted. "I hum many things without noticing. Why do you ask?" The man did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his eyes drifting, almost involuntarily, toward the hidden portrait in the corner, the painting of Lady Cecilia, seated at her harp, her gentle eyes gazing out from the canvas. Alira followed his gaze, and a slow understanding began to form in her mind, though she could not yet be certain of it. "You knew her," Alira said softly. It was not quite a question. The man's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, Alira feared she had overstepped, that her words had touched something too private, too painful to be spoken of so directly. But instead of retreating, he simply nodded, his eyes still fixed on the portrait. "She was my wife," he said quietly. The words settled over the room like a held breath. Alira's heart quickened, understanding now, at last, exactly who was standing before her. This was not simply a member of the household. This was the Duke of Ashcombe himself, the reclusive master of the manor, the man who never attended his own gatherings, The man whose grief, it seemed, had followed her all evening, without her ever realizing it. She did not know what to say. Every polite phrase she might have offered felt suddenly too small for the moment, too formal for the quiet vulnerability she had just witnessed. Instead, she said the only thing that felt true: "Her portrait is very beautiful." The Duke turned to look at her then, properly, for the first time since he had entered the room. Something in his expression softened, just slightly, as though her simple words had reached him more than any careful speech could have. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The candlelight flickered gently between them, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of music from the gathering continued, unaware of the quiet, unexpected moment unfolding in the small room at the back of the house. Elira did not know, standing there in the soft light, that this brief and unplanned meeting was only the beginning. The silence between them stretched on, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt, instead, like the kind of quiet that follows an honest moment, fragile, but real. Elira remained seated near the harp, her hands resting gently in her lap, while the Duke stood a few steps away, his gaze drifting once more toward the portrait of his late wife. "Forgive me," he said finally, his voice steadier now, though still quiet. "I did not intend to speak so plainly. It has been some time since I have spoken of her at all." "There is nothing to forgive," Elira said gently. "Grief does not follow polite rules. It comes when it comes." He looked at her then, something like surprise crossing his face, as though he had not expected such understanding from a stranger who had only just learned his name. "You speak as though you understand grief yourself." Elira hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about the quiet room, the flickering candlelight, and the honesty, already exchanged between them, made her answer without much thought. "I lost my mother when I was 16. She was the one who taught me to play. This harp was hers, before it was mine." The Duke's expression shifted again, softer this time. "Then perhaps that is why your music carries the way it does. There is something behind it, something real." Elira felt her cheeks warm slightly at the compliment, though she was careful not to let it show too openly. "I only played what I was asked to play, Your Grace." At the formal title, something flickered across his face. Not quite discomfort, but close to it. "Please," he said. "Not tonight. My name is Julian. I would rather hear it than the title, if only for a few minutes." It was an unusual request, and Elira knew it was not her place to accept it so easily. A harp tutor did not address a duke by his given name, no matter how quiet the room or how honest the conversation. And yet, something in his tone, tired, sincere, entirely without the arrogance she might have expected from a man of his position, made her nod. "Julian," she said softly, testing the word. He seemed to relax slightly at the sound of it, as though the single word had lifted some small weight from his shoulders. He moved toward the window, glancing briefly out at the darkened garden before turning back to her. "May I ask your name as well?" he said. "I was not given the chance to learn it properly." "Elira," she said. "Elira Vance." "Elira," he repeated, as though committing it carefully to memory. "It suits the way you play." She was not entirely certain what he meant by that, but she did not ask him to explain. Instead, she glanced again toward the portrait in the corner of the room. "You said this was her music room." Julian nodded slowly. Cecilia loved to play, though not the harp. The piano was her instrument. She would sit for hours in this very room, playing pieces she had written herself. After she passed, I could not bring myself to remove her portrait, though I also could not bear to see it hung where guests might ask questions I did not wish to answer. So it remains here, in this quiet room, where only a few people ever come. "And yet you allowed a stranger to play here tonight," Elira said gently. "My sister insisted," Julian admitted, a faint, almost reluctant smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Josephine believes music might help me find my way back to the world again. I did not expect her to be right so quickly." Elira felt a small flutter of something unfamiliar at his words, though she could not name it clearly. She reminded herself, gently but firmly, of the distance between them. A duke and a village harp tutor, worlds apart in every practical sense. Whatever this strange, honest conversation was, it could not mean more than a single unusual evening. And yet, she found herself in no hurry to leave. "The melody you asked about earlier," she said, steering the conversation back to safer ground. I believe I remember it now. It is an old song, one my mother used to hum while she worked. I do not know its proper name. I am not even certain it has one. Would you play it? Julian asked. If it is not too much trouble. Elira glanced at her harp, then back at him, feeling the pull of curiosity now settling firmly between them. I can try, though I cannot promise it will be perfect. I have never written it down. She turned to her harp, letting her fingers rest lightly on the strings for a moment before she began to play. The melody that emerged was simple, unpolished, compared to the practiced waltz she had performed earlier that evening, but there was a warmth to it, a familiarity that came from years of half-remembered humming rather than formal training. It rose and fell gently, like a lullaby, carrying with it the quiet comfort of childhood memories. Julian listened without moving, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance, as though the melody had carried him back to another time entirely. When she finished, several long seconds passed before he spoke. Cecilia used to hum something very similar, he said quietly. I had not heard it in years. I thought, perhaps, my mind was only remembering it wrong. It may be a common tune, Elira offered gently. Perhaps something both our mothers knew, passed down through different families. Perhaps, Julian said, though his voice carried a note of something closer to wonder than doubt. The moment stretched between them, filled with the quiet echo of the melody still hanging in the air. Neither of them spoke for a while, content, it seemed, simply to sit with the memory the music had stirred. Eventually, a soft knock interrupted the silence. Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully composed, though Elira could see a flicker of surprise cross her face at finding the Duke seated so comfortably in conversation with the young harpist. Your Grace, Mrs. Whitfield said, bowing slightly. Lady Josephine is asking after you. The guests are beginning to depart. Julian rose slowly, as though reluctant to end the conversation, though his composure returned quickly, the formal mask of a duke settling back over his features. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. I will attend to it shortly. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated a moment longer, glancing between Julian and Elira with an expression that suggested she had many questions she would not dare to ask aloud, before she nodded and left the room. Julian turned back to Elira, his expression once again careful, though something in his eyes remained softer than it had been at the start of their conversation. I am grateful for this evening, Miss Vance, more than you know. I am glad my playing brought some comfort, Elira said, rising from her seat as well, mindful now of the formality expected of her once again. It was more than comfort, Julian said quietly. He paused, as though considering his next words carefully. Would you be willing to return? Not for a gathering, but simply to play. My sister has long wished for more music in this house. I believe, perhaps, she was right to insist upon it tonight. Elira's heart quickened at the request, though she was careful to keep her expression composed. I would be honored, Your Grace, if the household wishes it. Julian's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him all evening. Julian, he corrected gently, at least while we are alone. Julian, she repeated, allowing herself a small smile in return. He nodded once, as though satisfied, and turned to leave the room, pausing briefly at the doorway to look back at her. Thank you, Elira. For tonight, and for the melody. I did not expect either. With that, he left the room, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Elira alone once more with her harp, the flickering candlelight, and the quiet portrait of Lady Cecilia watching from the corner of the room. She sat back down slowly, her mind racing with everything that had happened in the span of a single evening. She had come to Ashcombe Manor, expecting to play one simple waltz and return home before nightfall. Instead, she had met the reclusive Duke of Ashcombe himself, shared a private conversation about grief and memory, and somehow, without quite understanding how, found herself invited back into his quiet, guarded world. She did not know what to make of it. A part of her, the sensible part that had spent years teaching harp to village children and managing a modest, steady life, warned her against reading too much into a single evening's kindness. Grief made people reach for comfort in unexpected places, and she was wise enough to understand that Julian's warmth tonight might simply be the product of a difficult anniversary, a lonely house, and a melody that had reminded him of his late wife. And yet, another part of her, quieter but persistent, could not stop replaying the sound of her name in his voice, the way his expression had softened when she spoke of her own mother, the genuine gratitude in his eyes when he thanked her for the evening. Before she could untangle her thoughts further, Mrs. Whitfield returned, informing her that the carriage was finally ready to take her home. Elira gathered her things carefully, casting one last glance at the hidden portrait of Lady Cecilia before she left the room. As the carriage carried her back through the darkened countryside toward Renfield, Elira stared out the window at the passing fields, her mind still full of the evening's events. She thought of the letter that had arrived that morning, simple and formal, requesting nothing more than a single waltz. She thought of how far that simple request had carried her, into a grand hall filled with music and dancing, into a quiet room holding a hidden portrait, into a conversation she never could have anticipated. She did not know, as the carriage rolled steadily toward home, whether she would truly be invited back to Ashcombe Manor, or whether tonight would remain a single, unusual chapter in an otherwise ordinary life. But she found, much to her own surprise, that she hoped for the former. When she finally arrived home, Martha was waiting up for her, full of questions about the evening, eager to hear every detail of the grand manor and its mysterious household. Elira answered what she could, though she found herself holding back the most important part of the evening, the quiet conversation in the music room, the melody that had stirred old memories, the gentle request to return. Some things, she decided, were too new, too fragile, to share just yet. That night, lying in bed with the moonlight filtering softly through her window, Elira found herself thinking not of the grand hall, or the elegant guests, or even the beautiful manor itself, but of a quiet room at the back of the house, a hidden portrait, and the sound of her own name spoken softly by a man she had never expected to meet. She did not yet know how much that single evening would change the course of her life. She only knew, as she finally drifted toward sleep, that she was already looking forward to whatever might come next. A week passed before the letter arrived, and in that time, Elira told herself many times that she should not expect it. She continued her lessons in the village as usual, teaching the Hartley girls their scales on Tuesday afternoons, correcting young Thomas Reed's grip on the strings each Thursday, and returning each evening to the quiet cottage she shared with her aunt. Life continued much as it always had, steady and familiar, and yet something in her had shifted since the night at Ashcombe Manor. She found herself glancing toward the road more often than usual, half expecting to see a carriage approaching, though she scolded herself each time for the thought. When the letter finally came, it arrived not by messenger on horseback, but through the regular post, folded simply, and addressed in a careful, elegant hand. Elira recognized the crest pressed into the wax seal at once, the hawk with its wings spread wide. Her heart quickened as she opened it. The letter was from Lady Josephine, not from Julian himself, though Elira found herself both relieved and, quietly, a little disappointed by that fact. It requested her presence at Ashcombe Manor the following week, not for a formal gathering this time, but for private lessons. Lady Josephine explained that she herself wished to learn the harp, and that her brother had spoken highly of Elira's skill and character. The letter was polite, warm even, though carefully professional, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred during Elira's first visit. Elira read the letter twice before setting it down, a small smile forming despite her attempts to remain composed. She would be returning to Ashcombe Manor after all. Martha noticed the change in her niece almost immediately. "You have been humming all morning," she remarked over breakfast, raising an eyebrow as she poured the tea. "Something has put you in good spirits." "I have been asked to give lessons at the manor," Elira said, keeping her tone as light as possible. "Lady Josephine wishes to learn the harp." Martha studied her for a long moment, the kind of careful, knowing look only an aunt who had raised a child since girlhood could give. "Is that all it is, then? Lessons? What else would it be?" Elira asked, though she felt her cheeks warm slightly under her aunt's gaze. Martha said nothing further, only smiled to herself and returned to her tea, leaving Elira to wonder exactly how much her expression had given away. The following week, Elira returned to Ashcombe Manor, this time without the nervous uncertainty that had accompanied her first visit. The carriage ride felt shorter now that she knew where it led, and when the manor came into view, rising grand and familiar against the afternoon sky, she felt something closer to comfort than awe. She was greeted at the door by Mrs. Whitfield, whose earlier caution seemed to have softened somewhat, though she remained as efficient and proper as ever. "Lady Josephine is waiting in the music room," Mrs. Whitfield said, leading Elira through the familiar halls. "She is eager to begin, though I suspect her patience for practice may prove shorter than her enthusiasm for the idea." Elira smiled at the observation, and when she entered the music room, she found Lady Josephine already seated near the harp, examining the instrument with a mixture of curiosity and mild apprehension. "Miss Vance," Lady Josephine said, rising to greet her properly. "Thank you for coming. I confess, I have wanted to learn for some time, though I never quite found the courage to begin." "There is nothing to fear," Elira said warmly. "Everyone begins somewhere. I am certain you will find it comes more naturally than you expect." Over the following hour, Elira guided Lady Josephine through the basics: how to hold her hands, how to pluck the strings gently rather than force them, how to listen for the small differences between notes. Lady Josephine proved to be a diligent, if occasionally impatient student, frowning in concentration each time her fingers fumbled, laughing softly at her own mistakes rather than growing frustrated by them.
As the lesson progressed, Elira found herself relaxing further, enjoying not only the teaching itself, but Lady Josephine's easy, genuine company.
There was an openness to her that reminded Elira, in some ways, of Julian's own quiet honesty during their first conversation, though Josephine's warmth expressed itself far more readily, without the careful hesitation her brother seemed to carry. "You have a natural patience for teaching," Lady Josephine observed during a brief pause in the lesson. "My brother mentioned as much after your first visit, though he is not usually one for such observations." Elira's hands stilled slightly on the strings. "He spoke of the evening?" "Only briefly," Josephine said, studying Elira with the same sharp, observant eyes Elira remembered from their first meeting. "Though I confess, it was more than he has spoken of any gathering in quite some time. You should know, Miss Vance, that my brother has not been himself since Cecilia passed. He attends to his duties, of course, but the warmth he once carried has been difficult to find. Whatever you said to him that evening, it seemed to matter." Elira was unsure how to respond, torn between the desire to share what had happened and the awareness that the conversation had felt deeply private, not meant for repeating, even to someone as kind as Josephine. "We spoke only briefly," she said carefully. "About music, mostly, and a little about loss." Josephine's expression softened, though her sharp eyes remained thoughtful. "That is more than most manage with him these days. He has built quite a wall around himself, Miss Vance. I do not say this to place any burden upon you, only to explain why I was glad, truly glad, when he suggested you continue visiting the household." The words settled warmly in Elira's chest, though she was careful not to let her expression reveal too much. "I am glad to help, in whatever small way I can." The lesson continued for another half hour, before Josephine, laughing at her own tired fingers, declared herself finished for the day. As Elira began packing away her things, a soft knock came at the door, and Julian entered the room, his expression composed, but his eyes brightening slightly at the sight of Elira. "Miss Vance," he said, inclining his head politely. "I had hoped I might catch you before you departed." "Your Grace," Elira replied, matching his formality, though she noticed the corner of his mouth twitch slightly at the title, as it had during their first conversation. Josephine, gathering her own things nearby, glanced between the two of them, with an expression Elira could not quite read, curious perhaps, though carefully neutral. "I will leave you both to it then," she said, offering Elira a warm smile before slipping out of the room, leaving an unmistakable, if unspoken, invitation for privacy behind her. Once they were alone, Julian's formal posture relaxed slightly. "How did the lesson go?" "Very well," Elira said. "Your sister has a good ear, though her patience will need time to catch up with her enthusiasm." Julian's laugh was soft, but genuine, and Elira found herself smiling at the unfamiliar sound of it. That sounds precisely like Josephine. She has never been one for patience, in music or otherwise. They spoke for a while longer, the conversation drifting easily between small, comfortable topics, the Manners Gardens, which Julian mentioned Elira might enjoy seeing properly sometime, the melody she had played during her first visit, which he admitted he had found himself humming quietly in the days since. There was an ease between them now that had not been present during their first, more formal meeting. a familiarity that seemed to have grown, quietly, in the week since they had last spoken. Elira left the manor that afternoon, with a lightness in her chest she had not felt in a long time, though she reminded herself carefully, as the carriage carried her home, that friendship and comfort were not the same as anything more. Julian was a duke, still deep in grief, adjusting slowly to the presence of music and conversation in his life once more. She was a village harp tutor, grateful for the opportunity to teach, careful not to read more into small kindnesses than truly existed. And yet, over the following weeks, her visits to Ashcombe Manor became a regular occurrence. Twice each week, she arrived to teach Lady Josephine, and more often than not, Julian found some reason to join them by the end of the lesson, sometimes to listen quietly from a nearby chair, other times to speak with Elira directly about music, memory, or simply the small events of his day. The household staff, initially wary and watchful, grew gradually more accustomed to her presence, and even Mrs. Whitfield's careful formality softened into something closer to warmth each time Elira arrived. Word of the visits, inevitably, began to spread. Servants whispered among themselves about the change in their master, his willingness to leave his study more often, the rare sound of his laughter echoing occasionally through the halls, the careful attention he paid whenever the harp tutor's name was mentioned. Some of the staff seemed pleased by the change, grateful to see the household slowly returning to something resembling life. Others exchanged more cautious glances, aware of the delicate difference in station between a duke and a village tutor, wondering quietly where such visits might eventually lead. Elira, for her part, tried her best not to dwell on the whispers she occasionally overheard, focusing instead on the genuine friendship growing between herself, Josephine, and increasingly, Julian himself. She told herself, again and again, that she was simply grateful for the opportunity, for the income, for the beautiful manor, for the kindness of a family still healing from loss. But some nights, lying awake in her small room, back in Renfield, she found it harder and harder to convince herself that gratitude alone explained the quiet anticipation she felt each time a new letter arrived, requesting her return to Ashcombe Manor. She did not yet understand where this new, unexpected friendship might lead, or what complications might arise from the growing bond between a duke still mourning his late wife and a harp tutor who had never expected her music to carry her this far. She only knew that each visit left her with more questions than answers, and a quiet, persistent hope she was not yet ready to name. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to Elira's life that she had never expected, yet had quietly come to treasure. Twice each week, sometimes 3 times, when Lady Josephine's enthusiasm outpaced her patience, the carriage arrived at the small cottage in Renfield, and Elira made the familiar journey to Ashcombe Manor. The manor no longer felt like a distant, intimidating place. It had become, in its own quiet way, a second home. But autumn was settling over the countryside now, and with it came a change in the air at the manor that Elira could not ignore. The staff seemed busier than usual, carrying stacks of correspondence through the halls, arranging furniture in rooms that had stood closed for years, preparing for something Elira did not yet understand. She learned the reason on a cool afternoon in late September, as she waited in the music room for Josephine to arrive for her lesson. Instead of Josephine, it was Julian who entered the room, his expression more troubled than she had seen it in weeks. "Forgive the interruption," he said. "Josephine has been called away by our aunt this afternoon. I hoped you might permit me a few minutes instead." "Of course," Elira said, setting aside the sheet music she had been arranging. "Is something wrong?" Julian sat down slowly in the chair near the window, the one Josephine usually occupied during their lessons, and was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "My aunt, Lady Beatrice, has taken it upon herself to remind me of certain responsibilities." Elira waited, sensing there was more he wished to say. "The Ashcombe title requires an heir," Julian continued, his voice carefully measured, though Elira could hear the weight beneath his words. "It has been 3 years since Cecilia passed. My aunt believes, and much of society along with her, that it is time I consider remarrying. There is to be a formal ball held here next month. Guests from several noble families will attend, families with daughters my aunt considers suitable." Something tightened in Elira's chest at his words, though she was careful to keep her expression composed. "That seems a reasonable expectation, for a man in your position. Perhaps, Julian said, though his tone carried little conviction. I have avoided such gatherings for years, using grief as my excuse. My aunt no longer accepts it. She says the estate cannot wait indefinitely for my heart to heal. Elira found herself unsure how to respond, torn between offering comfort and maintaining the careful distance she had promised herself she would keep. Grief does not follow a calendar, she said finally. But perhaps your aunt is not entirely wrong either. The estate, the title, they carry weight beyond your own feelings. Julian studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. You speak sensibly, as always. I find myself wishing, sometimes, that sense came more easily to me. The conversation drifted into silence, and Elira busied herself with the harp strings, unsure what else to say. She told herself, firmly, that this news changed nothing between them, that whatever quiet friendship had grown over these weeks had never been anything more than that, and certainly could not compete with the practical demands of a duke's household. And yet, she could not entirely ignore the small, unwelcome ache that settled in her chest at the thought of the ball, of the noble daughters who would attend, of the future Julian's family expected of him. You will need music for the ball, I imagine, she said, steering the conversation toward safer ground. Julian's expression shifted slightly, something almost hopeful crossing his face. Yes, and I confess, I would like your help arranging it, if you are willing. I have not chosen music for a formal gathering since Cecilia passed. I find I trust your judgment more than my own, in such matters. I would be honored, Elira said, and she meant it, even as a quiet part of her wondered how she would feel, standing among the musicians at the ball, watching Julian dance with a young woman his family had chosen for him. Over the following weeks, the preparations for the ball consumed much of the household's attention. Elira found herself visiting the manor more frequently than ever, no longer simply for Josephine's lessons, but to help select the evening's music, arrange the small orchestra that had been hired for the occasion, and offer her opinion on which pieces might suit the formal, elegant atmosphere the event demanded. She and Julian spent long afternoons in the music room, poring over sheets of music, discussing which waltzes might open the evening, and which quieter pieces might accompany dinner. Their conversations, once careful and formal, had grown easy and familiar, filled with small jokes and comfortable silences that neither felt the need to fill. It was during one such afternoon that Lady Josephine found them, seated close together at the piano, laughing over a particularly clumsy attempt by Julian to hum a melody he could not quite remember correctly. Josephine paused in the doorway, watching them for a long moment before either noticed her presence. You two seem to be managing well without me, she said, a note of amusement in her voice, though her eyes carried something more thoughtful as she studied the easy familiarity between them. Julian straightened slightly, clearing his throat. Miss Vance has been helping arrange the music for the ball. So I see, Josephine said, though her tone suggested she saw a great deal more than the music arrangements alone. She stepped further into the room, taking a seat nearby, her expression turning more serious. Julian, might I speak with you a moment, privately? Julian glanced at Elira, a brief apology in his eyes, before following his sister to the far corner of the room. Elira busied herself with the sheet music, though she could not help overhearing fragments of their hushed conversation. Josephine's voice, urgent and low, followed by Julian's quieter, more measured responses. She caught only a few words clearly, careful, and her position, and what people will say, before the conversation ended, and Julian returned to the piano, his expression more guarded than before. Is everything well? Elira asked carefully. Yes, Julian said, though his tone lacked its usual ease. Josephine worries, sometimes, more than necessary. Elira did not press further, though the exchange left a quiet unease settled in her chest for the remainder of the afternoon. Later that day, as Elira was preparing to leave, Josephine caught up with her in the hallway, her expression softer now, though still carrying the weight of whatever conversation had passed between herself and her brother. Miss Vance, Josephine said, might I walk with you to the carriage? Of course, Elira said, though she sensed, correctly, that Josephine had more to say than simple pleasantries. They walked together in silence for a moment, before Josephine spoke again, her voice careful. I hope you will forgive my directness, Miss Vance, but I feel I must speak plainly. I have watched my brother these past weeks. and I have not seen him this at ease since before Cecilia passed. For that, I am deeply grateful to you." "Thank you, my lady," Elira said, sensing there was more to come. "But I must also be honest," Josephine continued. "The ball next month is no small matter. Our family's position, the estate's future, the expectations placed upon Julian, these are not things easily set aside, however genuine the friendship between you and my brother has become." Elira felt her chest tighten at the careful warning beneath Josephine's words, though she kept her expression steady. "I understand, my lady. I have never expected anything beyond friendship. I am grateful simply for the opportunity to help, and to know your family." Josephine studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching Elira's face, as though trying to determine the full truth behind her calm words. "I believe you," she said finally, "and I do not say this to cause you pain, Miss Vance. I say it because I care for my brother, and I have come, in these past weeks, to care for you as well. I simply wish for both of you to walk carefully, whatever this friendship may become." The words settled heavily in Elira's chest as she climbed into the waiting carriage, and she found herself turning them over again and again during the long ride home. She had told herself so many times that her visits to Ashcombe Manor were nothing more than professional obligation, that her growing fondness for Julian's company was simply the natural result of shared music and honest conversation. Josephine's careful words, however kindly meant, made it impossible to continue pretending so easily. That night, Elira sat by her window long after Martha had gone to bed, staring out at the quiet darkness of the village, turning Josephine's warning over in her mind. She thought of the noble daughters who would attend the ball, families far more suited to the Ashcombe name than a village harp tutor could ever be. She thought of Julian's tired, honest eyes each time he thanked her for a small kindness, the easy laughter that had grown between them over these past weeks, the quiet ache she felt at the thought of watching him dance with someone else at his own ball. She did not know, staring out into the darkness, what the coming weeks would bring, whether the growing bond between herself and Julian was destined to remain nothing more than a quiet, private friendship, carefully bound by the practical realities of rank and duty, or whether something more honest, more difficult, was beginning to take root beneath the surface of polite conversation and shared music. She only knew, as she finally turned from the window and prepared for bed, that the ball, now less than a month away, would bring answers to questions she had not yet allowed herself to fully ask. The final weeks before the ball passed quickly, filled with a steady stream of preparations that left the entire household busy from early morning until late into the evening. Elira continued her visits to Ashcombe Manor, though the easy, unhurried afternoons of the past months had given way to a more focused purpose. Selecting the final pieces of music, arranging the small orchestra's schedule, and ensuring every detail of the evening's entertainment would meet the expectations of the many noble guests soon to arrive. She told herself, again and again, that this was simply another task, no different from the many small favors she had already performed for the household, and yet, each time she walked through the manor's grand halls, now filled with fresh flowers and polished silver, in preparation for the coming event, she felt an unease she could not quite shake, a quiet awareness that the ball would mark the beginning of something she was not entirely ready to face. Julian, for his part, seemed equally troubled by the approaching evening, though he spoke of it less often than Elira might have expected. Their conversations during this time turned increasingly toward the practical: which pieces would suit the opening dances, how many musicians the small orchestra required, whether the evening should include a formal dinner before or after the dancing began. It was easier, Elira suspected, for both of them to focus on such details than to address the larger, more complicated truth hanging quietly between them. One afternoon, as they sat together reviewing the final selection of music, Julian set down the papers in his hands and looked at her with an expression more open than she had seen in several days. "I must confess something to you, Elira," he said quietly. She looked up from her own notes, sensing the shift in his tone. "Of course. I dread this ball," he admitted, his voice carrying a weariness she recognized well by now. "Not the dancing itself, nor the music, which I trust entirely to your good judgment. It is the purpose behind it that troubles me. My aunt has already sent word to several families, each with daughters she considers suitable matches. I am expected, it seems, to choose a bride from among them before the year's end." Elira's chest tightened at his words. though she kept her expression carefully composed, as she had trained herself to do these past weeks, whenever such matters arose. That is a great deal of pressure to carry into a single evening. It is, Julian agreed. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, before he continued, his voice lower now, more hesitant. I find myself wondering, more and more, whether any of the women my aunt has chosen could ever understand me the way. He stopped himself abruptly, leaving the sentence unfinished, though the weight of his unspoken words settled clearly enough in the space between them. Elira's heart quickened, uncertain whether she was meant to understand his meaning, or whether she was reading far too much into a simple moment of hesitation. The way? She asked softly, unable to stop herself. Julian looked at her then, his expression carrying something raw and unguarded, though he quickly composed himself once more, as though remembering, suddenly, the careful boundaries both of them had maintained for so long. The way this household has come to feel less empty these past months, he said instead, his voice steady again, though Elira sensed the words were not quite what he had originally intended to say. She did not press him further, though the moment lingered in her thoughts long after their conversation had returned to safer, more practical matters. She recognized, with growing certainty, that whatever careful distance she had tried to maintain between herself and Julian had grown thinner with each passing week, no matter how firmly she reminded herself of the impossible gap between a duke and a village harp tutor. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Julian walked her to the entrance hall himself, rather than leaving the task to a servant, as had become his quiet habit these past weeks. Elira, he said, pausing at the base of the grand staircase, will you attend the ball? Not simply to arrange the music, but as a guest, if only for a portion of the evening? The request caught her entirely off guard. Your Grace, I could not possibly attend as a guest. My position in this household is— I am aware of your position, Julian interrupted gently. I ask regardless. You have brought more warmth to this house in these past months than I believed possible. I would like you present, in whatever capacity you are willing, on an evening that otherwise fills me with very little joy. Elira hesitated, torn between the practical wisdom of refusing and the quiet, persistent hope that made her want desperately to accept. I will be present to oversee the music, she said carefully, offering the only compromise she felt she could reasonably make. Perhaps for a short while, I might observe the evening as well. Julian's expression softened, though he did not press her further. That is more than I hoped for. Thank you. The days that followed passed in a blur of final preparations. Lady Josephine, though she said little more on the matter of Elira's growing closeness with her brother, watched the two of them with careful, knowing eyes whenever they were together, her earlier warning still hanging unspoken between them. 2 days before the ball, Elira arrived at the manor to find the household in a state of controlled chaos. Servants carrying arrangements of flowers through every hall, extra staff hired from neighboring villages to assist with the evening's demands, and Lady Beatrice, Julian's aunt, presiding over it all with sharp, exacting instructions that left little room for error. Elira had not yet properly met Lady Beatrice, though she had heard a great deal about her sharp tongue and exacting standards from the household staff. Their first meeting came unexpectedly, in the music room, as Elira was arranging the final sheets of music for the orchestra. You must be the harp tutor, Lady Beatrice said, her voice carrying the same sharp authority Elira had heard described so often. She was an older woman, elegant and composed, with eyes that missed very little. Elira Vance, my lady, Elira said, offering a proper curtsy. Lady Beatrice studied her for a long, assessing moment. My nephew speaks of you often, perhaps too often, for a man in his position. Elira felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her composure carefully in place. I am only here to arrange the music for the evening, my lady. Yes, Lady Beatrice said, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. See that it remains so, Miss Vance. My nephew has responsibilities to this family and to this estate that cannot be set aside for fond feelings, however genuine they may be. The words carried a clear warning beneath their polite formality, and Elira understood, with quiet certainty, that Lady Beatrice had noticed far more than Julian likely realized. I understand entirely, my lady, Elira said carefully. I have never expected anything beyond my role in this household. Lady Beatrice's expression did not soften, though she gave a small, satisfied nod before turning to address some other matter of the evening's preparations. leaving Alira standing alone in the music room, her earlier hope now tangled with a fresh, heavier weight of caution. That night, lying awake in her small room in Renfield, Alira found herself facing the truth she had avoided for weeks. Whatever careful friendship had grown between herself and Julian, whatever quiet hope had settled in her chest each time he sought her company, the reality of his position remained unchanged. He was a duke, bound by duty to his family's expectations, soon to choose a bride from among the noble daughters gathering for the ball. She was a village harp tutor, however fondly regarded, standing entirely outside the world he was expected to inhabit. She told herself, firmly, that she would attend the ball only to oversee the music, as she had promised. She would watch, from whatever quiet corner suited her position, as Julian danced with the young women his aunt had chosen, and she would return home afterward, grateful for the friendship she had been fortunate enough to share these past months, however brief it might ultimately prove to be. And yet, despite her careful resolve, she could not entirely silence the quiet, persistent hope that lingered stubbornly in her chest. The memory of Julian's unfinished sentence, the raw honesty in his eyes before he had caught himself, the warmth in his voice each time he spoke her name. The ball was now only 2 days away, and Alira understood, with growing certainty, that whatever answers awaited her that evening, they would not be simple ones. The night of the ball arrived with a clear autumn sky, cold and bright, the stars scattered like small points of light above Ashcombe Manor. By the time Alira's carriage reached the estate, the drive was already lined with the carriages of arriving guests, footmen moving briskly between them, and the manor itself blazed with candlelight from every window, spilling warm gold across the darkened gardens. Alira had chosen a simple dress for the evening, deep green, modest compared to the fine silks and jewels she knew the other guests would wear. She had reminded herself, dressing that evening with careful hands, that she was there to oversee the music, nothing more. Whatever hope had lingered in her chest these past weeks, she intended to keep it quietly folded away, out of sight, for the duration of the evening. The grand hall, when she entered it, had been transformed entirely from the gathering she remembered months earlier. Every candle in the house seemed to have been lit, chandeliers glittering above a room filled with noble guests in their finest clothing, their voices rising in a steady hum of conversation and laughter. Long tables lined one wall, heavy with food prepared for the occasion, and at the center of the room, the orchestra she had helped arrange was already tuning their instruments, preparing for the evening's first dance. Alira made her way toward the musicians, greeting them quietly, offering last adjustments to the evening's program. She kept her eyes carefully away from the growing crowd of guests, unwilling to search too openly for a particular face among them, though she was keenly, painfully aware of every moment that passed without seeing him. She did not have to wait long. As the orchestra prepared for the opening waltz, a hush began to settle over the hall, and Alira turned, along with everyone else, toward the grand staircase, where Julian now appeared, dressed formally in deep blue, his expression composed in the careful, practiced manner she recognized from his public appearances. Beside him stood Lady Beatrice, and trailing a step behind, several young women in elegant gowns, each clearly among the guests his aunt had specifically invited. Alira's chest tightened at the sight, though she forced herself to remain composed, focusing instead on the musicians preparing before her. This was, after all, exactly what she had expected. This was the purpose of the evening, and she had no right to feel the quiet ache now settling behind her ribs. The opening waltz began, and Julian, as custom demanded, led the first dance with one of the young women his aunt had introduced, a pretty, poised woman named Miss Caroline Ashford, whose family, Alira had overheard earlier, held considerable standing among the neighboring estates. Alira watched from her position near the orchestra, her expression carefully neutral, as Julian moved through the familiar steps of the waltz with practiced grace, his face composed, polite, giving away nothing of his private thoughts. She told herself this was exactly as it should be. She told herself, again and again, throughout the following dances, as Julian partnered with several more of the young women present, that she had known from the beginning this evening would unfold precisely this way. And yet, as the evening wore on, she noticed something she had not expected. Each time Julian's gaze swept across the room between dances, it seemed to search, briefly but unmistakably, toward the orchestra, toward the quiet corner where Alira stood. Each time their eyes met, however briefly, Something in his composed expression softened, just slightly, before he was pulled back into the demands of another polite conversation, another expectant introduction. Lady Josephine found her during a brief pause in the music, slipping quietly to Elira's side with a small, knowing smile. "You look as though you are trying very hard not to watch him," she said gently. "I am simply here for the music, my lady," Elira replied, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. Josephine studied her for a moment. Her earlier caution from weeks before now softened into something closer to sympathy. "For whatever it is worth, Miss Vance, I do not believe my brother's heart is anywhere in this room tonight, save for the small corner where you are standing." Before Elira could respond, the orchestra began preparing for the next piece, and Josephine was called away by a group of guests, eager for her attention, leaving Elira alone once more, with her racing thoughts. The evening continued, dance after dance, the hall growing warmer with the press of guests and candlelight. Elira busied herself with small adjustments to the music, quiet conversations with the musicians, anything to keep her mind from dwelling too heavily on the careful, painful distance she had maintained all evening. She had nearly convinced herself that the evening would end exactly as expected, with Julian's formal duties fulfilled, his aunt's expectations satisfied, and Elira quietly returning home once the music concluded, when the orchestra's leader approached her with an unexpected question. "His Grace has requested a change to the program," the man said, holding out a small folded note. "He asks that this piece be played next, rather than the one originally planned." Elira unfolded the note with uncertain fingers, and her breath caught as she recognized the request written in Julian's familiar hand. It was not one of the formal waltzes they had carefully selected together for the evening's program. It was the simple, old melody she had played for him that very first night in the quiet music room, the half-remembered tune her mother used to hum, the one that had reminded him so powerfully of his late wife. Her heart pounded as she looked up, searching the crowded hall until she found Julian standing near the center of the room, his gaze already fixed steadily upon her, waiting. The room had grown quieter now, guests beginning to notice the unusual pause in the evening's program, murmurs rising softly as they waited to see what would happen next. Elira understood, with sudden clarity, that Julian was not simply requesting a piece of music. He was making a choice, openly, in front of every noble guest his aunt had gathered for this very purpose, a choice that had nothing to do with practical duty or family expectation. Her hands trembled slightly as she nodded to the orchestra, stepping forward to take up her own harp, which she had brought that evening, more from habit than expectation. The musicians fell silent, and slowly, carefully, Elira began to play the simple, familiar melody, her fingers finding the notes with practiced ease despite the pounding of her heart. The room remained hushed as the gentle tune filled the hall, so different from the formal, elegant waltzes that had come before it. Elira did not look up from her harp as she played, though she could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the murmured questions rippling quietly through the crowd, the sharp, assessing gaze of Lady Beatrice somewhere near the front of the gathering. When the final note faded into silence, the room remained still for a long moment before Julian stepped forward, crossing the open floor directly toward Elira, ignoring entirely the startled whispers now rising around him. "Thank you," he said quietly, though his voice carried clearly in the hushed room. "That melody means more to me than any other piece I could have chosen tonight." Elira lowered her harp slowly, uncertain how to respond amid the watching crowd. "I am glad it brought you comfort, Your Grace." "It is not comfort I wish to express," Julian said, his voice steady despite the weight of every eye upon them. "I wished, tonight, to be honest, with my family, with my guests, and most importantly, with myself." He turned then, addressing the room directly, his composed formality giving way to something more open, more vulnerable than Elira had ever witnessed from him in public. "I know this evening was arranged with certain expectations in mind. I understand the responsibilities I carry, and I do not take them lightly. But I find I can no longer pretend that my heart has not already been claimed these past months, quietly, by someone I did not expect to find it." A ripple of astonished murmurs spread through the gathered guests, and Elira felt her own heart pounding so loudly, she feared everyone in the room might hear it. She caught sight of Lady Beatrice's sharp, disapproving expression near the front of the hall, and beside her, Josephine's face, bright with unmistakable joy. Julian turned back to Elira. his eyes carrying none of the careful distance he had maintained throughout the earlier dances. "Elira," he said softly, though the silence in the room carried his words to every corner, "I do not ask you to answer tonight, in front of all these guests. I ask only that you know the truth, as I have finally allowed myself to know it. Whatever difficulties lie ahead, whatever my family's expectations demand, I would rather face them honestly than continue pretending my heart belongs anywhere other than where it truly does." Elira's eyes filled with unexpected tears, though she blinked them back carefully, aware of the many eyes still watching. "Julian," she said quietly, using his given name openly, for the first time, in front of the entire gathered hall. "I never expected any of this when I was asked to play a simple waltz all those months ago." "Nor did I," Julian said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his careful composure. "But I find myself deeply grateful that you did." The room remained divided in its reaction, some guests exchanging scandalized whispers, others watching with quiet fascination, and Lady Beatrice's sharp disapproval standing in clear contrast to Josephine's open delight. Elira understood, even in this powerful, unexpected moment, that the difficulties ahead would not simply disappear. Society's judgment, the family's expectations, the practical realities of rank and duty, none of these had vanished simply because Julian had spoken honestly in a crowded ballroom. But as she looked into his eyes, steady and open, in a way she had never seen before, she understood something else as well. Whatever challenges awaited them, Julian had chosen, deliberately and publicly, to face them honestly, rather than continue hiding behind duty and careful distance. And she found, standing there with her harp still in her hands, that she was ready to face those same challenges beside him, however uncertain the path ahead might prove. In the weeks that followed, the household at Ashcombe Manor would face its share of difficult conversations. Lady Beatrice's continued disapproval, the careful, gradual work of easing society's judgment, the practical questions of how a duke and a village harp tutor might build a life together within a world built on careful distinctions of rank. None of it would prove simple, and Elira understood this, even as she stood in the hushed ballroom that night, her hand finally reaching out to meet Julian's own. But she understood something else as well, something that settled warmly, and certainly in her chest, as the orchestra, sensing the moment, began quietly playing once more, the guests slowly returning to their dancing, their whispered conversations gradually fading into the familiar rhythm of the evening. She had come to Ashcombe Manor many months ago, expecting nothing more than to play a single, simple waltz for guests she would never see again. She had not known, that first evening, that the Duke of Ashcombe was listening from behind a hidden balcony, his grief slowly easing with each note she played. She had not known that a simple, half-remembered melody would carry her into a friendship, and then something far deeper, with a man she had never expected to meet. Now, standing beside him in the warm candlelight of the grand hall, surrounded by the quiet murmur of a household finally beginning to heal, Elira understood that some of life's most important moments arrive exactly this way, quietly, unexpectedly, carried forward not by grand design, but by the simple, honest connection between two people, willing, finally, to be truthful with themselves and with each other. The waltz continued around them, and as Julian drew her gently into the dance, Elira allowed herself, for the first time that evening, to simply be present in the moment, grateful, hopeful, and entirely unafraid of whatever the future might bring.